In our headlines at this hour, U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman is here in Seoul for talks with the South Korean counterpart amid fresh warnings of an impending nuclear test by North Korea. Truck drivers affiliated with the Korean Federation of Trade Unions are staging an indefinite strike starting on this Tuesday, calling for the extension of a system that guarantees basic. Hello and welcome. You're watching the Daily Report. It's Tuesday afternoon, June 7th here in South Korea. I'm in Son Heung-min. South Korea and the U.S. are prepared to respond to any provocation by North Korea, including a nuclear test. So said U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman on this Tuesday after talks here in Seoul with her South Korean counterpart, Cho Hyun-dong. Sherman stressed nuclear tests violate UN Security Council resolutions and vowed Seoul, Washington, Tokyo and the international community would respond firmly and visibly. Cho, for his part, added exploring new sanctions against Pyongyang has become inevitable. With regard to efforts to ensure a global, comprehensive strategic alliance as shared during last month's Yoon-Biden summit in South Korea, Cho said the two countries have agreed to activate strategic exchanges on various levels, including a 2+2 diplomatic and security ministerial meeting. The bilateral alliance is reportedly rooted in shared values, including democracy, to uphold the rules-based international order in support of a free and open Indo-Pacific region. And in related news, there have been fresh warnings about an impending nuclear test by North Korea from both the UN's nuclear watchdog as well as the US State Department. Our Kim Yo-sun reports.
The chief of the IAEA has expressed concerns that North Korea may be preparing for a nuclear test. Addressing the agency's Board of Governors on Monday, Director General Rafael Grossi explained that one of the tunnel entrances at the nuclear test site in Punggye in the north of the country has been reopened as part of possible preparations for a nuclear test. He added that this was consistent with similar activity for previous nuclear tests in North Korea. He further noted that a nuclear test goes against the UN Security Council and would cause serious concern. In related news, the U.S. State Department has also raised concern over the possibility that the North could conduct a nuclear test in the near future. Speaking to journalists on Monday, State Department spokesperson Ned Price called the situation something that Washington has warned of for some time, adding that it is a contingency that the U.S. has been planning for. Against his backdrop, a senior U.S. official highlighted that Washington and its two closest Asian allies, Seoul and Tokyo, remain ready to counter any threat posed by the North. Speaking during a forum jointly hosted by the Center for Strategic and International Studies and Korea Foundation, Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, Daniel Crittenbrink, however, commented that the door to diplomacy remains open. He further added that the U.S. does and will not link its humanitarian assistance for the North to progress in denuclearization talks with the regime. Kim Yo-sun, Arirang News.
President Yoon Suk-yeol has called for communication and cooperation with local governments. The remarks were made at a cabinet meeting earlier on this Tuesday following last week's local elections. Describing local governments as key partners for state affairs, he shared intentions to meet with elected mayors and governors as soon as possible. He also touched upon a long-term growth plan for the semiconductor industry, stressing the need to nurture young talent as he seeks to cut the red tape over the corporate arena. Meanwhile, 110 bills were passed at Tuesday's cabinet meeting, including a revised law to allow platform delivery workers access to insurance compensation should they suffer from an occupational accident. Also on the local front, truck drivers have taken to the streets on this Tuesday, demanding for the extension of a system put in place amid the pandemic that guarantees basic freight rates. Our Kim Hyun-sung has more.
Unionized truckers in South Korea began their strike at the stroke of midnight on Tuesday. They're demanding a freight fare hike. With diesel prices skyrocketing, truckers say that it's impossible to maintain a living. The truckers' main demand is an extension of the safe trucking freight rates system, which guarantees minimum freight rates for truckers. After a 3-year run, that system is due to expire on the last day of this year. According to a union official, they have failed to reach a consensus with the government over these demands, which is why they're going on strike. Around 25,000 members of the Cargo Truckers Solidarity are estimated to be taking part in the strike. some non-unionized truckers may join the movement as well. And at 10 p.m. Tuesday, union members nationwide held the strike's official launch ceremony. Although unionized truckers make up only 6% of cargo truckers in the country, the government says that it's still enough to impede cargo delivery. To make up for any disruptions caused, the government is allowing the government and privately owned cars to make cargo deliveries. Prime Minister Han Duck-soo had called the strike a burden to the national economy and people, and that the government will react sternly to any illegal actions. Kim Hyun-sung, Arirang News.
South Korea has confirmed 6,172 new cases of COVID-19 on this Tuesday. The daily tally has been hovering below the 10,000 mark for a few days now. There were also 20 more COVID-19 related fatalities and 117 remain in critical condition. Starting tomorrow, that is Wednesday, South Korea will no longer require unvaccinated arrivals to quarantine for 7 days. But COVID-19 testing before and after flying into South Korea remains necessary. Staying with viral diseases, but moving over to the U.S., the first possible monkeypox case in Washington, D.C. has been identified in a resident who recently traveled to Europe. Authorities say the individual tested positive for orthopox, the family of viruses that includes monkeypox. Samples have reportedly been sent to the CDC for further testing. And according to the CDC, some 25 monkeypox cases have been identified in the U.S. Officials at the WHO say 780 cases have been reported in 27 non-endemic countries thus far. In the UK, Prime Minister Boris Johnson has survived a motion of no confidence prompted by lawmakers amid growing discontent over his leadership following revelations of rampant parties during the country's COVID-19 lockdown. Our Ishi-Hu has more.
The UK Prime Minister survived a no-confidence vote on Monday despite 41% of his own lawmakers voting against him. Johnson, in office since his predecessor Theresa May resigned in 2019, has been facing criticism after photos showing he and his staff attending alcohol-fueled parties in his office and residence were released. The scandal, also known as Partygate, references gatherings that took place while Britain was under strict COVID-19 lockdown in 2020 and 2021. A critical report on the lockdown parties was published last month, revealing that Johnson was fined by the police for attending a rule-breaking party in 2020. The fine meant Johnson became the UK's first serving prime minister to be sanctioned for breaking the law. This led to at least 15% of Conservative MPs writing letters of no confidence to Sir Graham Brady, the chairman of the party's backbench 1922 committee, which triggered a no confidence vote. And on Monday, 59% of Tory MPs backed the prime minister. A total of 211 Conservative Party lawmakers voted they had confidence in Johnson's leadership, while 148 voted to oust him from Downing Street. The result throws a prime minister a lifeline, keeping him in office and protecting him from another no-confidence challenge for a year. However, the result marked the worst verdict on a sitting prime minister by their own party in recent times. The vote share in support of Johnson was lower than the 63% received by former Prime Minister Theresa May when she won a party confidence vote in 2018 before resigning 6 months later over a Brexit deadlock. Meanwhile, Johnson said the result would enable the country to move on from questions about his leadership.
So, I think this is a very good result for politics and for the country. I do. Just in this sense, I think it's a convincing result, a decisive result, and what it means is that as a government we can move on and focus on the stuff that I think really matters to people.
Tory rebels have vowed to keep trying to force Boris Johnson from office, while opposition leader Sir Keir Starmer said that the vote marks the beginning of the end for the Prime Minister. Ishi-Hu, Arirang News.
Right, and that is all for part one of the Daily Report. In part two, we share with you a rather unfortunate social phenomenon here in South Korea. Stay with us.
what matters.
Welcome back. On this segment of Viewpoint, we address South Korea's low birth rate, its causes, broader consequences and possible countermeasures with a panel of foreign journalists. I have Sebastian Felletti here in the studio. Sebastian, welcome back.
Good morning.
I also have Cheryl Tay joining this session virtually from Singapore. Cheryl, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thanks, it's a pleasure as well.
Right. Sebastian, we'll start here in the studio then. South Korea's fertility rate plunged to a fresh low last year to stand at 0.84. How does this figure compare to those of its OECD counterparts?
Well, it's now become, from last year, South Korea started to see its population declining for the first time since we have statistics. So it's a watershed. And it is even more important because already South Korea was trailing. If you look at the OECD, which encompass most of the developed countries, especially in Europe, I mean, South Korea was already trailing in that ranking. There's other countries in the OECD who are also having a very low birth rate. This is the trend of most advanced economy. In Italy, in Germany, it's also going very low. And of course, in other Asian countries like Singapore or Taiwan, we're seeing a similar trend. But clearly, Korea is following that trend, but in a very radical way. And so now South Korea is about to become maybe one of the most aged society in the world. If we look at the projection for the coming years, that's what is the trend. So it's a very significant trend because it has a lot of implication, of course, for society, for business, for people, for families in the future in this country, and of course also the overall strength of the country. There's a lot of implication here that we can discuss.
Right, we will in a few minutes, of course. Then, Cheryl, then, as Sebastian has mentioned, then this decline in birth rate, it's not simply a Korean phenomenon. It is a broader global reality. Do you agree?
Very much so. I totally agree that it's part of a global phenomenon that we're seeing, particularly in developed countries, though there are specific reasons as to why each country is facing this issue. It certainly isn't unique to Korea. So for one, China has seen a sharp decline in its birth rate. The country is now allowing families to have 3 children instead of 2 after once-in-a-decade population census last year that showed that it logged its slowest population growth since the 1950s. And Japan, too, is facing some very real issues with its fertility rate. The number of births in 2021 in Japan fell by 3.5% from 2022 to the lowest level on record. So it's clear now that Korea is facing a similar phenomenon, probably not too dissimilar to that of Japan and China. For example, last July, I wrote about how a dip in the birth rate over time in South Korea has led to hundreds of abandoned and crumbling schools in the country. And these schools are closing simply because there's not enough students to go to them. And while the people who've taken over some of the properties have found really charming ways to repurpose them, it's symptomatic of a really real issue that the population will just get older and older.
Right, really it is, Cheryl. And staying with you, Cheryl, what can you share with us about the situation there in Singapore with regard to birth rates?
Well, in Singapore, we too have faced some challenges with the birth rate, but things have remained fairly stable over here. For instance, in March 2022, the numbers were sitting around 34,000 births, similar to 2020. So while the birth numbers were constant, Singapore's total fertility rate rose slightly last year, up from a historical low in 2020. So it's not fair to say that the birth rate here is dipping. Things have remained fairly constant, if still dismal. So there were some fears that the pandemic might lead to a lower birth rate, but that doesn't appear to have come through. It actually led to the government tabling a pandemic baby bonus, which is in fact paying people $3,000 if the child's date of birth falls between October 2020 and September 2022. And I do believe Singapore's current baby bonus system is providing parents a sizable sum. However, I understand that we do have one of the lowest fertility rates in the world. So, yeah.
Right, I see. And Sebastian, Elon Musk has been sounding the alarm on falling birth rates here in South Korea, in neighboring Japan, over in Hong Kong, as well as in Italy, which he says will die out. What do you suppose are the chances of such a scenario, as in dying out, for South Korea, where the fertility rate is well below the 2.1 minimum needed to sustain that as a society?
Well, of course, I mean, this has been sounding alarm among politics, among demographics. If we follow the trend, of course, there are some very spectacular figure here. I mean, even some studies show that maybe in 2100, the population of Korea will have been halved by 2. It will be divided by 2 compared to today's. So that's really spectacular. It seems that after 2050, the population will start to really shrink. That's what's the projection. But we also have to look at demography as a complex phenomenon that entails a lot of dimension. That it's politics, it's about psychology, it's about economy. And so when we look at history in many other countries, there's also some surprises. There is some, it doesn't always happen the way it has been planned. But if you look at neighboring Japan, it looks like for now Korea is following the path of Japan, and we're already seeing a spectacular reduction of the population in Japan. So South Korea is going to face that, and it's still not as vivid in your daily life, because still we have quite a lot of young people here in the street in Seoul. In the population, it's still a very dynamic workforce. But of course, we can see that in the next decade, we're going to start to see very much this consequence on the daily life, on the number of people in the shops, the people driving taxis, buses, and that's going to require new tools. So do you go for immigration? Do you go for more technology like robotics? How do you replace this workforce? That's going to be some very key question for the leaders in this country in the coming decades.
Right, massive challenges right there.
And sensitive ones.
Right. Cheryl, staying with the grim prospects, but focusing more on the near future, based on your coverage of social issues here in South Korea, what look to be the immediate challenges for this country amid its declining birth rate? I mean, earlier you mentioned about schools being deserted in the absence of students. Tell us a bit more.
So I've written a few articles about this, and I think there are several challenges that are becoming immediately apparent. And for one, like I referenced earlier, schools closing and towns becoming depopulated might become a very real issue. Like Sebastian mentioned, we're seeing this in Japan, which has a problem of not having enough children to take over businesses in rural areas and not enough people to fill up some empty homes that just rot and decay where they stand. So after reporting on that issue of Akia, or empty homes in Japan, it became pretty clear to me that at some point there just might not be enough people to go around. And needless to say, declining population growth is worrying countries like China and Japan as much as it is South Korea, because of immediate short-term consequences of not being able to replenish the labor force. So, as we all know, retirees constitute a growing segment of the shrinking population with fewer government resources to help them. And healthcare might also become a very immediate and pressing issue with an aging population that's exerting more and more pressure on the system in time to come. So I think that these are some of the immediate challenges, and as Sebastian said, very sensitive ones that the government might need to look into.
Right. And Sebastian, what do you care to highlight as the potential near-term problems of fewer babies here in the country? I mean, you've mentioned about the situation with regard to the labor market. What about security for South Korea?
I mean, security in the global context. I mean, of course, I mean, South Korea being a military that is based on conscription, that will be an impact. Of course, in the long term. There's also like a general image of power that is projected by country. If you have a shrinking population, it's a different image you project outside in the outside world. So these things matters. But of course, I mean, when it comes to security, there are advanced army, advanced technology alliances are also very important. As I don't think that's necessarily going to change the big picture here. This issue here, it's more about self-confidence of the country, self-confidence of the nation. Do you go? Are you still an outward-looking country, or are you gonna turn more inward? We see, for example, in Japan, a younger population is increasingly looking inward, less traveling abroad, less studying abroad. There's less appetite to explore outside. So there is a consequence about. On the medium long term on demography can bring a country to be more open to the world, more outgoing, I would say, and if you are facing that kind of challenge, you might want to be more defensive. So that these kind of things can play out on the long run.
Right, of course. Cheryl, let's now shift our focus to the underlying causes, perhaps, behind the low fertility rate here. What do you believe are the main reasons, then?
From my reporting, several factors have sort of surfaced as underlying causes. For one, I understand there is a bit of a debt crisis brewing in South Korea right now. In 2021, the total amount of debt that South Koreans ran up was more than $1.5 trillion, which is no small sum. So this essentially means that millennials are, even if they have decent jobs, stuck in a vicious cycle of debt. And I'm not sure that this does the birth rate any favors. It's a logical connection between being saddled with debt and not thinking that one is in such a situation that would be ideal for having a child. And another serious underlying reason might also be the affordability of property. With wages being fairly stagnant and competition for good real estate in prime neighborhoods, it's unrealistic to expect husbands and wives to want to produce one, let alone multiple children, without the area to raise them in. And also, I think there's this concept, sampo or posede, which is manifesting more and more. I interviewed several young South Koreans, some of whom live in Goshiwon and face real great pressure to still succeed. So a sizable level of job insecurity coupled with income inequality added to a significant cost of living might have led people to think of South Korea as not exactly the best place to raise a child. So I think that these structural factors added to a more cultural shift in how women might be viewing the idea of forgoing marriage and motherhood in pursuit of higher education might all factor into why we might be seeing a dip in the birth rates. So, yeah.
Right, some very valid points there, of course. And Sebastian, what more do you care to add to perhaps the underlying causes here in South Korea?
I fully agree with what Cheryl was saying. And of course, the economic factor, the economic burden is often pointed out by this new generation, saying that there's too much cost, it's too expensive to buy a house. That's one of the reasons why this new generation decide not to get married. We have the so-called sampo generation, which is basically decided not to be in a relationship, not to marry, and not to have kids. That's a very fundamental decision that is made here, and they talk about the economy, but I think we should also not overlook the psychological dimension, the values behind. And the values in South Korea is a very competitive society. There's a huge pressure for people, including young people, to succeed. And succeed means to have the best. Succeed is to have the best job. If you have a kid, you need to bring this kid to the best university. There's always a push to overachieve. And I think that's creating a lot of pressure on the population. So I think that's one key factor behind also the low birth rate in South Korea, but also in places like Singapore. People will want the best. So if you have a kid, you might just have one because you have limited resources, a limited budget. So you want to focus your resources on only one because you want that one to get the best treatment, the best place to live, the best apartment, and the best education. So I think that's a very important factor that is ingrained in the society here. That is also a factor explaining also this low birth rate.
Right, of course, a possible factor. Cheryl, then, so we understand the causes and the consequences of declining birth rates. Then the million-dollar question now is, how do governments devise policies to boost birth rates? And that being said, what do you believe needs to be done, Cheryl?
All right, it's clear that the government has realized there's a need to do it, which is step one. However, there's a deeper issue that maybe needs to be addressed before we even begin to talk about children or encouraging couples to have children. For one, as I mentioned earlier, there are some structural inequalities that need to be addressed. And women need to see it not as a burden, but a value-adding proposition to have children. This means it doesn't stop at baby bonuses, childcare options other than relying on one's mother-in-law, and allowances at work for working mothers without being penalized at the workplace or having to give up their jobs all need to be taken into consideration. And beyond that, I've touched on some very fundamental issues that stand in the way of people being financially stable enough or having enough resources to raise a child. If the price of housing isn't addressed or if people's personal debt continues to balloon, these are very real considerations that need to be looked into if you want a population that wants to have kids or finds themselves in a place where they might want to have them. Also, I think there's an issue here of a mindset change. Generationally speaking, this might be a sweeping statement, but millennials might not find the idea of having children part of what they consider a good life. Raising a child to college age is no mean feat, and the appeal of having a double income, no kids family unit is fairly alluring. So it all comes down to the basic fact about whether it's even possible for a government to convince a young professional that having children is a plus and not a minus to their life.
Right, I see. Sebastian, beyond Korea, France, for its part, boasts a steady birth rate. What do you suppose is behind that reality?
Well, I mean, France is, of course, the declining trend in the EU is also a declining trend, and France is also part of this. But in average in France, in the EU average, France is among the countries who still keep a quite solid birth rate. And there are many factors, of course, but I think one of the key factors is probably about some support from the state. In terms of infrastructure, we're talking about kindergarten, nursing homes. So the key question, I think, in France is about the role of the woman in the workplace. So basically, I think in South Korea is often asked, maybe for a woman, you have to choose between your career or having a family. That's often a dilemma. In France, I think there's a lot of the norm is that most women, it's normal, you won't choose. You will have a career, but you can have a family. So that means the regulation allows you to keep your job and keep the same job when you come back from a maternity leave at the same level. So the company has to guarantee that. It means also that very quickly after birth, you can also leave your baby, your newborn, to a nursing home that is subsidized by the state, which means that the woman who wants to go back quickly to work can also do it fairly easily. I mean, nothing is perfect, but that's one part I think that makes a big difference, is the fact that women don't always think about whether I'm going to have a career or a family. So that there is this context behind that means that a lot of them want both, actually, and so most of them will still choose that route. I think that's a major difference. And of course, there's some mentality, there's some values behind too. I mean, I think if you take a survey for a lot of French people, having a family, having kids is part of the key factor behind happiness. And they will see it more as a positive development than a burden. So I think for a lot of people, they will envisage having a family as a plus and something enjoyable, not just a duty. It's like they will even see it as a way of fulfillment. Like having a kid is a way to fulfill your aspiration, to have a happy life. So that's the aspiration. And then, of course, making it happen is much more challenging. But there is a context that can allow a lot of people to at least
think about having children.
Yes.
Right. Well, stay with what you said. Elon Musk actually said that children need to be celebrated. All right.
He has a lot.
Right. He does. All right, Sebastian. Thank you very much for your time and your thoughts today.
You're welcome.
And Cheryl, over in Singapore, thank you very much for your insights today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The local travel and tourism industry has a new marketing strategy. It's aimed at offering extravagant experiences to those seeking to splurge here in South Korea. Our Yoon reports.
These are visitors to South Korea from Malaysia, but they are no ordinary tourists. They are dubbed luxury tourists or VIP clients, which means they take business class flights, stay at hotels with at least a 5-star rating, and spend more than $10,000 during their trip. Compared to common Malaysian travel packages to South Korea, the cost of a trip for these luxury clients runs 3 to 4 times higher. For this trip, the price per person was around $6,000. And the theme of this visit was enjoying local gourmet dining at luxury restaurants in Seoul and Busan.
500,000 of Malaysians will come to Korea annually. So after this trip, if I found that the destination, places, the hotel, the food is very suitable for the clients of Malaysia or Southeast Asia.
A group of returning VIP tourists are those that come for international business functions. Such conferences and events that had been on hold since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic are slowly resuming. These business events always include group tours around the city for its participants, which helps local tourism. As Japan plans to open doors to foreign tourists again starting June 10th, the South Korean government is now in a rush to promote various destinations across the country. One of the first programs of its kind invited travel industry representatives from the United States and Canada to experience the latest Cheongwade tour, which was previously the executive office and official residence of the President of South Korea, also known as the Blue House.
It's really an honor to be here and amazing to see in person. So I feel very grateful to be here, and it's so beautiful and lovely. A little overwhelming, in a good way.
To further promote travel to South Korea, the Korea Tourism Organization has been spreading the Feel the Rhythm of Korea promotional video series that feature cities like Yeoju, Pyeongchang, and Incheon. Now that the time to revive the tourism industry post-COVID-19 has come, South Korea is focusing more on growth and quality than quantity. Through luxurious travel products, the Korea Tourism Organization plans to attract at least 300 luxury tourists this year. 이은진, Arirang News.
And now, imagine the comfort and convenience of having a Starbucks drink delivered to your seat at a local sports stadium, because that is precisely the reality at Incheon SSG Landers Field. Our Arirang explains.
A wind of change is blowing for Starbucks Korea. South Korea is Starbucks' fifth largest market, with over 1,500 stores across the country. And it has been less than a year since the country's retail giant E-mart became the majority owner of Starbucks Korea after buying an additional 17.5% stake. With this new ownership in place, the coffee giant is setting itself a new challenge, a collaboration between Starbucks Korea and E-mart's baseball team, SSG Landers.
In this baseball stadium, you can find the very first Starbucks to open in a sports stadium. And they even deliver orders to your seats.
Starbucks Korea says the delivery service has been added to improve customer satisfaction by letting baseball fans fully enjoy a game without missing play. To upgrade its customers' experiences even more, further collaboration with E-mart's affiliates is being considered.
Starbucks Korea is aiming for collaborations with E-mart's affiliated companies online and offline. Going beyond the baseball stadium, for the first time it opened a branch at a golf course owned by one of E-mart's affiliates.
But it's not just Starbucks that's trying out new collaborations after an acquisition process. GS Retail, another Korea-based retail business, has become the new owner of Yogiyo, an online food delivery app. The retail giant acquired Yogiyo last year for 800 billion won, or around $684 million. And now the app has added a service called Yo-mart. By using the service, customers can now shop for goods online from a nearby GS Fresh Mall and receive them within an hour. A representative of GS Retail said the service differs from other delivery platforms.
Quick commerce platforms are usually available only in the Greater Seoul area, but GS malls are located across the country. This allows Yo-mart to become the first app of its kind in Korea to make the service available in all regions.
He also added, by making use of practical knowledge and skills from GS Retail, it's planning to collaborate even more with the delivery app. Lee-hyun, Arirang News.
Seoul City is resuming late-night subway services. According to Seoul Metro, the operation hours of lines 2, 5, 6, 7 and 8 have been extended to 1 a.m. Trains have operated until midnight since April 2020 as part of COVID-19 containment efforts. By August, all lines will run until 1 a.m., although weekend and public holiday services will terminate at midnight. The city cited the need for more late-night travel options due to a lack of taxis after social distancing measures were eased. A pair of autographed football boots worn by EPL Golden Boot winner Son Heung-min has sold for $12,000 at an auction. The new owner, a college student, placed the successful bid during a charity event Monday held by the Korea Football Association. Now, Son wore the boots during South Korea's World Cup qualification win over Iran in March. The buyer says he plans to keep the boots as a family heirloom. Profits from the auction will be donated to a new football center in Cheonan. Ukraine's invasion, well, Russia's invasion, that is, of Ukraine and its related repercussions on the world's grain supplies are shedding greater light on South Korea's declining food security and the need to strengthen its self-sufficiency. My colleague Kim Bo-kyung has more on this week's feature segment.
We might have plenty of food on our plates and think that South Korea will never be short of food. But that assumption could be wrong.
그러나 만약에 우리나라에 어떤 비상사태가 발생했다. 우리가 경제 제재를 받게 됐거나 뭐 전쟁 같은 게 일어났다. 그러면 지금 2개월 이내에 우리나라에 먹을 게 없어져. 전쟁이 한 2개월만 지속되면 한국 사람은 무기로 전투에 지는 게 아니라 먹을 게 없어서 전쟁을 포기해요. 이게 굉장히 위험한 일이거든요.
An expert's desperate warning on the need to secure food supplies. Food security means that all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food, which meets their food preferences and dietary needs for an active and healthy life. Then what is the level of South Korea's food security? The food self-sufficiency rate for staple grains, rather than grains for animal feed, was at just 45.8% in 2020, dropping severely from over 80% in 1970. When feed grains are included, it gets even worse. The sufficiency rate stood at 19.3% in 2020, falling below the 20% mark for the first time. Compared to other major countries, we can see how low it is.
The situation is the most dire for wheat, with a sufficiency rate that's under 1%.
Korea's low self-sufficiency rate for wheat. What is the reason behind this? Of course, cultivating crops is tricky as low temperatures can hinder growth, while damage from pests is also a factor. But an expert says these issues are easy to overcome, saying the biggest problem is actually the price gap between domestic and imported wheat.
대표님, 아무래도 이 최대 수출국들의 수출 금지 규제나 또는 전쟁 때문에 이제 수입산 밀의 가격이 많이 올랐잖아요. 그만큼 국내산 밀의 수요나 가격이 또 긍정적인 영향을 받은 것이 있나요?
그러게요. 지금 작년 대비 올해 그 전쟁이나 수출 금지로 인해 가지고 한 50%에서 60% 정도 수입밀이 이렇게 인상된 것 같아요. 그렇지만 국내산 밀과 가격 차이는 아직도 2배 정도. 지금 국내산은 한 1,000원 정도 지금 유지하고 있거든요. 그러면 그 가격 차이 때문에 아직은 업체들에서도 국내산 밀에 이렇게 눈을 돌리고 있는 것은 보이지 않습니다.
The best way to tackle the problem, of course, is to increase production, have more farms grow wheat. The new Yoon administration, realizing the urgency of the matter, has announced plans to bring up the wheat self-sufficiency rate to 7% by 2027. The government has been buying wheat through the Industry Promotion Act since 2021, where it makes contracts with farms in advance to boost wheat cultivation. The purchase price is a little over $30 for 40 kilograms of wheat, while the imported wheat price is less than $15. Some say increasing the domestic wheat purchase price would be the answer, but farmers say giving incentives could be a better solution.
Production costs are twice as expensive, naturally leading to a price gap between processed products. If the purchase price goes up, it's a burden for companies as the price competitiveness goes down. Instead of raising the purchase price, the government should come up with incentives.
Of course, producing more grains is the direct solution to the food security crisis. But it might take years, perhaps decades, for grain production to reach a high enough level. Another way to tackle the food security crisis is to store the food. Currently, the government and the Korea Agro-Fisheries and Food Trade Corporation store grains at 14 storage bases.
I'm at one of the 14 storage bases located in Jangseong-gun County of Jeollanam-do Province. This is where reserves of wheat, sesame seeds, and beans are kept. In this room alone, there are 800 tons of wheat, all divided into 1-ton sacks.
근데 단장님 여기 밀 비축기제 들어오니까 약간 으스스해요. 이거 왜 그런 건가요?
그것은 밀 품질 관리를 위해서 온도를 10도씨 정도로 유지하고 습도도 50% 정도 유지하고 있기 때문에 그렇습니다. 저희들이 품질 관리를 위해서 월 1회 검사를 실시하고 있습니다.
In order to strengthen the self-sufficiency infrastructure for wheat, the government is gradually increasing the amount purchased, aiming to have 30,000 tons of wheat stored by 2025. Currently, when there are not enough storage facilities, private storage bases are often used. To expand grain reserves, more bases are needed.
If the wheat reserves are expanded, it will be difficult to store all of that in our 14 bases. And to have a variety of kinds of grain stored, there should be specific facilities for each category of grain.
Storing grains is one way to improve food security. Another way to tackle the issue at an individual level is to reduce food waste.
지금 어마어마한 음식물 쓰레기 양이 이 트럭을 통해서 계속 들어오고 있거든요. 하루에 평균적으로 몇 톤 정도 계속 들어오고 있나요?
성남시에서만 일일 200에서 210톤 정도 반입이 되고 있고요. 이걸 연간으로 환산하면 7만 2천 톤에서 7만 5천 톤 정도 반입이 되고 있습니다.
And that's just from Seongnam City of Gyeonggi-do Province. A total of 5.16 million tons of food waste were produced nationwide in 2020. That's around 14,000 tons a day. Most food waste gets turned into animal feed or fertilizer, but before this, alien substances need removing, and the waste needs to be dried and sterilized.
Processing costs differ for each facility. We spend around $48 to $50, but other places spend up to $96. This cost is also rising due to lots of factors, including high inflation.
Processing all this waste costs around $650 million a year. So how can we reduce food waste? First, we need to minimize the amount of food thrown away before it expires. Sell-by dates show until what date food can be sold, but food can be eaten safely after this date. Adding a use-by date would help reduce the amount of edible food mistakenly thrown away by consumers. South Korea is going to introduce use-by dates from next January. Restaurants and cafeterias should reduce food waste too. Seoul City Hall's cafeteria recently introduced an AI food scanner to measure how much food is needed. Another waste-saving piece of technology is the radio frequency identification, or RFID waste bin, which charges households a fee depending on the amount of waste they throw into it, encouraging people to reduce food waste. Bringing up the self-sufficiency rate, increasing the number of storage facilities to allow larger food reserves, reducing food waste. All of these efforts need to start with the realization that we need to prepare for food security crisis. 김보경, 아리랑 뉴스.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. Elon Musk has threatened to terminate his $44 billion deal to acquire Twitter after accusing the company of breaching their agreement. Musk's lawyers in a letter to the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission said that Twitter hasn't provided enough information about the number of fake users on the platform. They said Musk believes the company has resisted his rights to access data and information from the company under the takeover agreement, as he hasn't received information that he has repeatedly requested since May 9th. They also warned that the Tesla CEO has reserved his rights under the agreement, including his right to walk away and, quote, terminate it. Thousands of migrants on Monday started their journey toward the U.S. from the southern Mexico town of Tapachula. The timing of their trek coincides with the Summit of the Americas in Los Angeles, taking place this week, where U.S. President Joe Biden is expected to announce a regional pact on migration. According to migration activists, the group may be one of the largest migrant caravans to leave from the region in recent years, with eyewitness accounts estimating around 6,000 people. Made up mostly of Venezuelans, Central Americans, and Cubans, the group represents people attempting to flee poverty and violence in their home countries. Ahead of World Oceans Day on June 8th, international marine conservation organizations removed over 23.5 metric tons of waste from the seas around the Greek island of Ithaca. The cleanup took place over the last 2 weeks with volunteer divers from the UK, Netherlands, Lebanon, Hungary and Greece. They cleared dozens of abandoned heavy fishing nets from the seabed. This will be recycled into yarn to make products such as clothing and carpets. According to environmentalists, roughly 640,000 tons of fishing gear is lost or abandoned in the oceans each year. On Sunday, thousands of rowers crowded the canals of Venice for the city's Volgolonga Regatta. Setting off from St. Mark's Basin, around 7,000 rowers in over 1,700 boats took part in the 30-kilometer-long rowing marathon. Since the first regatta in 1974, the number of participants has steadily increased, and it features different types of rowing boats celebrating the spirit of the event. The regatta had been held virtually in 2022 and scaled down in 2021 due to the pandemic. Matthew Ashley, Arirang News.
Good Tuesday afternoon. Well, this morning, skies were bright in Seoul, but it's getting murkier across the country. Rain in the forecast has been expanded to most inland regions, so I hope you carried your brollies this morning. Well, mostly it's going to peter out overnight, but it will remain on and off in a few regions until early tomorrow morning. While the amount won't be much, up to 30 millimeters in Chungcheongnam-do and Jeollabuk-do provinces and on Jeju. And other regions will see 5 to 10 millimeters. But there will be pockets of heavy downpours in portion of Chungcheongnam-do province with a heavy rain advisory. So please be careful if you're out and about. And as the rain brings a cold air mass, it's going to stay cool in the afternoon, with Seoul reaching 25 degrees, while that is slightly below the average. While eastern areas are just around or below 20 degrees, affected by an easterly breeze. Well, we do have showers in the forecast on Wednesday and Thursday, and after that, temperatures are going to rise again. Now let's take a look at the worldwide weather conditions.
That is all for this edition. Do join us again same time tomorrow. Until then, take care. Thank you for now.